So today I'm talking to Hayo Reinders,
Very good.
who's kindly agreed to talk to me. He's here today in Nagoya at the Wireless Ready conference and talking about gaming and language learning. So before we talk about other things, I'd like to go back to your presentation today.
Sure.
Could you recap for us, for the listeners and watchers, about the PhD research that you were involved in?
Yeah, that's not my own research. That's one of my PhD students, Sorada Watana from Thailand, who's doing her PhD at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. She's doing a very interesting study where she's looking at the effects of gameplay on L2 interaction, specifically looking at the effects on the quantity and quality of L2 interaction. And so, for example, we're looking at the logs of the audio and chat interaction in the game, and then investigating things like what discourse functions appear within these transcripts. For example, what was the number of turns, what was the average length of each turn, and then compare this between different conditions. And secondly, also, as I mentioned during the talk, looking at the effects of gameplay on willingness to communicate. And of course, this is a very important concept, because you can be interested in language learning, but if you're not actually willing to try and make mistakes perhaps and take some risks in the language, in other words, if you're not willing to produce the language, create output, then you will probably have fewer opportunities to develop yourself. So if gameplay has an effect on this, then that could be a potentially very beneficial part of playing computer games.
You were fortunate enough to be able to adapt the existing role-playing game, right, to make the tasks more relevant for the learners. That's
right. So what Sorada did was look at the interface that you get when you play the game, and then adjust the instructions that appear within the game. So we were then able to get her to write quests, similar to web quests, but then for use within the gaming environment, in such a way that the quest would be meaningful for language interaction and language learning, and then have different quests and then investigate if these had different effects on the way that the students interacted within the game.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about things like DS games and online games and other existing language learning games, specifically for language learning. A lot of it's a little bit disappointing, right?
Yeah, a lot of it is very disappointing indeed. And I realized later, as I walked out of the room, that several members of the audience were actually publishers themselves, and I'd just shown all these examples of bad games. But yeah, it is very disappointing. There's very little pedagogy in there, or at least it may be pedagogically sound in a way, but it's not making use of the affordances that are available within the gaming environment. And I've always wondered about this, because developing your own game, obviously, even for a large publisher, would be a very, very expensive undertaking. But like this study that my PhD student and I are doing shows, it only takes just really a couple of people, and they can then themselves adjust an existing game rather than create an entirely new one, and make it suitable for the purposes of learning and teaching languages. So.
Well, that was another thing you mentioned in your conclusion, which I thought was really a very good point, about we should try and use existing games, and you said that applied linguistics shouldn't mess around with game design.
If your toilet's broken, you ring a plumber. You ring a professional to do whatever job needs doing. And applied linguists, we're not game designers, we're not software designers, we're not interface specialists. Let us deal with the pedagogy. Let us do the curriculum design, etc. But let's leave that part of it to the game designers, because you can see from all the examples that we looked at during the presentation today that. If you don't, then the results are really very disappointing. And imagine if you're a student, if you're a 17-year-old kid, and you're used to playing all sorts of very interesting, highly interactive, engaging games, and then there's this teacher who says, look, I've made this myself, and there's this 2D sort of completely boring so-called game. I mean, how is that going to interest you? How is that going to motivate you?
Yeah, you might as well just stick with the paper flashcards.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
You mentioned a few statistics, and of course I know that this particular project was with Thai learners, but a lot of the statistics that mentioned, and a lot of the statistics that I find are based on research in the United States.
True.
And of course, it's fascinating. There were things like, 21-year-old in the US would read for 5,000 hours, but spend 10,000 hours on a cell phone, and so on.
Yeah.
And later on, you mentioned that 42% of game players in the US are women, and they are very interesting. Do you think they are? We can extrapolate these points globally. Do you think this?
I think there will be market differences between different countries, different cultures. Maybe, perhaps not even on the surface, perhaps in terms of the number of male versus female players, but certainly in the types of games that learners play, or the types of games that female learners play in Japan as opposed to male learners in Germany or wherever. And I think it's important. We just don't have enough research. As you say, a lot of it comes from the US, a lot of it is quite sort of US-centric. It's important that we investigate different game practices in different cultures, in different settings, not just cultures, but also at home, in school, and in other environments. And until we get more data, until we better understand why people play games, how they play games, how they interact with games, what kinds of games work for certain types of learners and not for other learners, adult learners versus younger learners, etc., it's really hard to make any pedagogically meaningful decisions on how you're going to design a game. And that's a pity, because there is so incredibly much potential, I think, in them for all groups, for all cultures, males and females and ages.
So where did this initial interest in games come from? Why did you decide to start looking into this area?
Well, one of my main interests over the last few years has always been in the area of out-of-class learning. Anything to do with learner autonomy, anything really that can help us to encourage learners to interact with the language outside of the institution, outside of the school, outside of the classroom, and also to prepare learners for being able to do that. So autonomy comes into that, of course, but also using technology, any kind of technology that will hopefully encourage learners to continue and try out what they've learned in class, but then put it into practice, because without that, what are we talking about? And I realized, like here in Japan, obviously English is a foreign language, and it's hard to encourage learners to go out and find opportunities to use the language in a meaningful way. But games and other technologies do actually offer that opportunity. But without showing learners how to make best use of it, it's unlikely that learners will know what to do with it and will enjoy it. And I think there's a lot of potential there to draw on these kinds of environments and bring them into the classroom, and then prepare learners to be able to take them outside the classroom and then continue to learn with them.
You mentioned that you were interested especially in learner autonomy and things like this for some time, and I know you've done a lot of work with self-access centres. Do you think we need self-access centres anymore? Do you think we can just go virtual?
It's very interesting that you mentioned it. I mean, a self-access centre can be virtual, can be physical. So there's two questions here. One, should a self-access centre be a physical centre, or should it be online? A more interesting question to my mind is, do we need self-access at all? And I've just finished writing an article. It's called "The End of Self-Access," but then between brackets it says "as we know it."
Okay.
Right? So I do actually question at the moment the usefulness of self-access. There is not actually, and this is coming from somebody who's interested in it and who's worked in that area for quite some time, there is not a lot of research that shows that it has benefits. Or the research that is there is very anecdotal. It's research on self-access is difficult for all the reasons that we know. It's difficult to isolate variables that may affect learners' motivation and learning, etc. But nonetheless, we should try. I think we need to do more, and that hasn't been done. So at the moment, we don't know if it works.
Isn't that a lot to do with the fact it's so difficult to do it right?
You mean self-access learning, or the research on self-access?
Self-access learning. It's so difficult to establish a working self-access.
Yes, I think that may have to do with it. But I feel that the reason why I say the end of self-access is not because the principles are bad. It's just that I think there are other ways of implementing these principles in, for example, encouraging gameplay and developing this ability to play with and in the language and to enjoy this playful interaction and risk-taking, etc. And that is the kind of environment that the self-access centre for many years has always promised that it would offer. sort of a bridge. David Crabb and people like that have talked about self-access as a bridge between the safe classroom and the unsafe outside world. And then the self-access center sits in the middle and sort of prepares you for it. But it doesn't, because if you walk into 99 out of 100 self-access centers around the world, what you see is that learners study with the books that are given to them by teachers, usually pedagogically highly structured materials, and there's not a lot of this sort of more unstructured learning going on, the more sort of playful interaction that, again, for example, games do offer. So I think a lot of the self-access pedagogy, in terms of its delivery, will shift from a physical or even an online center or space to perhaps morphing into other kinds of environments, new learning environments, new learning spaces, like Cynthia White from New Zealand talk about, where learners interact horizontally with other learners who may or may not be part of the same classroom, and learn not just inside the school but also outside the school. So there's a lot more, I think, opportunity now than there was 3 or 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, definitely. I feel that the original idea of self-access was of a time, I think, and with technology there may be different needs, as you say.
Indeed, yeah.
This is a very broad question, and it's a very difficult one to answer then, but how do we deal with learner autonomy? There's always this difficult paradox that some learners may choose to exercise their autonomy by not studying themselves, or by asking for very teacher-centered and structured learning.
Yes.
How can we deal with that?
I don't know. I think that's always a bit of a cop-out, really, because that's quite extreme. That sort of taking what is a continuum and saying, well, if you go all the way to that extreme, then what do you do? Well, that extreme doesn't really occur that often. Doesn't happen that often. And even so, I think it's still our responsibility to try and help students see the other side of it. If an adult learner really decides, no, I don't want to do this or that, then so be it. But I think it's important at least to show learners different ways of doing things, and I do think that as a teacher you can encourage or perhaps even demand that learners at least have a look and try other things, and then perhaps make an informed decision. Okay,
I'm totally with you. I think autonomy is offering choices, isn't it? Offering opportunities to
and making learners understand that these choices exist, that they are being given different choices. It's not just giving learners different things to do without explaining to them why you're giving them different things to do. So it can turn into a very theoretical debate. In fact, I have to admit, I'm a bit disappointed with learner autonomy as a field. I've been interested in working in that particular area for 10 years now, and I don't see much progress, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of different areas of interest, learner autonomy, teacher autonomy, and sorts of different topics, but it seems to be the same debates again and again and again, and I'm more excited about other things at the moment.
Well, you've worked in a number of different countries and cultures. Where have you been? Where have you worked?
I've worked in Singapore for a year at RLC, Regional Language Centre there, 7 years in New Zealand at the University of Auckland. Spent a year here in Japan at Meiji University in Tokyo, and I'm currently in the UK. I was born in Holland, so all over.
What kind of differences do you notice about students in these different contexts?
Well, the usual differences, I think. Where are you from? Where are you born?
From the UK.
From the UK, so I mean, the UK and Japan, these are two countries that obviously you know, and there's a lot of differences in student expectations, conversely also teacher expectations, teacher behavior in the classroom, learner behavior. And going back to that discussion about autonomy, there's often this this question: can autonomy as a concept be applied to different cultures, or is it? And I always find that yes, it can. It's just not necessarily in the same way, in the same format. It has to be adapted to whatever local circumstances you're in. But for example, in Japan, yes, autonomy is perhaps more of a group, more of a group autonomy rather than an individual type of autonomy. So I do think it applies. But,
no, that's kind of what I was leading towards. I totally agree, and I think sometimes people think that autonomy means alone, but I think it very much means collaborative.
Absolutely, yes.
It's a big part of autonomy.
Yes, and people like Leo van Leer, whose 1996 book still is one of my absolute favorites, talks about interaction and autonomy and awareness. I mean, this key word interaction always comes back, and not just in the second language acquisition meaning of the word, as in language output production, but also the collaborative aspect of learning. Not learning on your own by yourself, but learning with others, from others, through others, and teaching others as well. And I guess going back to the theme of my talk earlier today on computer games, I think that's a real strength of computer games. Autonomy, self-access, it depends so much on the teacher, their interest, their ability to understand that concept and make it available to everyone, building on everyone. That is really quite a hard thing to do. And we talk about moving from a teacher-led to a facilitated type of instruction. But that transition is not an easy one. It's a very difficult one, in fact. And I think in practice you don't see many teachers, and I noticed that in my own teaching as well, who can actually reach that level of facilitation. And again, using computer games inherently is a social, collaborative, building on other people type of environment. So again, I think it offers a lot of potential, but it's just the challenge for us as teachers and researchers to build on what's possible within these games and make it pedagogically meaningful and turn it from entertainment into education. That's the big challenge.
I think that's an excellent note to finish on. So, Hayo, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.